I'm going to try to be less negative, since Hunter and Chase last week were like, God, what kind of terrible negative thing is Neva going to say this week? So I guess the only there I would like to I'm still struggling with his presentation of the relationship between eternity and time. And I think that that's really crucial. And I'm still struggling with that. It would be nice if I could get a little bit of clarity on that. And I think it's crucial. I think it's really crucial for him. And then it has overlaps with, Bergson and Heidegger and people like that. So that would be helpful. And the only other comment I have is I thought the end of this, well, frankly, the last page and a half, I just don't understand much at all. But I don't know if that's because I was just exhausted by the time I got there. I tried to read most of this all today, and it was like, by the last part of it. But I find his description of God and all these movements in God to be probably the most sophisticated an interesting conception of God I have ever seen, with the possible exception of Whitehead. So, I'm not terribly concerned about how well it fits with Christianity. I mean, he clearly thinks it does, and clearly tries to make that case. But the way he tries to somehow incorporate a non-linearly temporal movement within the primal Godhead, and that serves somehow as the foundation for the emergence of time as we experience it. And the problems that he cites with the tradition on, like, how can you have any creation from a deity that is absolutely changeless? I mean, those are classical problems in Christian theology. But I just think he has done provided amazing effort here in trying to come up with an idea of why is there something rather than nothing, and why is there time, and what are the fundamental components of fundamental metaphysics that must be in place in order to account for that. And I don't understand it all, but it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's pretty close to kind of the way I see it. It's like the most ambitious kind of philosophical project, or like project of thought you could actually conceive of, basically. He's trying to think of, basically, like, why is there something rather than nothing? And kind of his answer to that is also simultaneous to this answer of, how is there time? This thing is basically, out of this eternity of, unconsciousness, or just something that's unfathomable, you get somehow you get time, you get history, you get these finite particular things. It's basically the problem of beginnings, of how did this even come about? And then not even just beginnings, but beginnings also in light of, the present. And basically, because we're, to some degree, like these self-conscious, reflective beings, how does that come about? What kind of conditions, or what is the ground of all these metaphysical principles that make it where there's a universe where there's things that are self-conscious of themselves and can reflect on this and can even ask these questions, and then even to say, basically, like one of my friends likes to say, it's all just eternal consciousness or infinite consciousness. Okay, well, what are the metaphysical conditions that made it where there's a universe of eternal consciousness. And then how did that eternal consciousness become something temporal? So it's basically the same problems back again. And yeah, I think that's what he's really trying to do. And he's not giving this is not exactly the last account. I don't know if anyone's gonna just be like completely convinced by this and just, oh yeah, that's it right there. I mean, I think there's a reason he had just like an incredible amount of drafts of this work. This is just like the third one that survived, but there's something like 12 of them or something. So he kept trying to do this. It was basically like the ultimate like philosophical project, but it's a bit difficult, I guess. But yeah, I see that too, in the sense that he's using this concept of God, and there's the whole question of whether that's necessary or not. But I see it as kind of like it's just another kind of tool to try to answer these fundamental problems, basically. And he can only basically use the language of his culture, and that's what he was trying to do. And I think, yeah, even the stuff with like he'll have some elements of like Orthodox Christianity in there, but in a way they're like part of just like the system of what he's trying to do, in the sense of he's trying to incorporate all these things into his explanation, in a sense. So it's not even just Orthodox Christianity, he's got a whole bunch of other stuff in there. But yeah, it's yeah, this work I feel like is incredibly interesting. There's so much depth in it, and it's kind of like this fantastic failure to a certain degree. But well, I wouldn't call it a failure necessarily, but just it's remarkable just for its ambition. But so to actually try to go to your actual question of time and eternity and whatnot. So I don't feel like going into trying to do an explanation of it right now. So I think probably the best thing to do is to look at the text, where I think it was on like page 76 or something, that he gives this really good explanation of it, where I feel like for the first time I had a decent understanding of kind of exactly what he's talking about with that and why it's necessary. And I think it's
maybe it's the bottom of 79, perhaps.
Maybe that's it. Yeah, this PDF
yeah.
thing is, yeah.
The last partial paragraph on 79 that goes on to 80.
Yeah.
I think that's where he says, since the Godhead can only actualize itself from out of its free eternity, there must be something between free eternity and deed of actualization that separates the deed from eternity, so that eternity remains free and inviolable. And then he goes on, this something can only be time, but not time within eternity itself, but rather time coexisting with eternity. Anyway, that paragraph, I'm not sure if that's what you're thinking about, but that seemed to be really important. And I put a note to ask people about that. I don't, but that seems like he's laying out something really crucial there, but I'm having a very hard time understanding it.
Yeah, that was one of the passages that I kind of highlighted. I think there's one other one though, but the way that I kind of understand it is that he's saying kind of in the way that he has all these distinctions of like uppercase being, lowercase being, or the, or a lowercase being, and then that which has being. In a way, he's kind of trying to provide for how those things can be at the same time, in some sense. How there's different sort of degrees of being or types of being in simultaneity, which I think that's what he calls like the potencies. But then there needs to be this kind of act of revelation where the Godhead actually takes the form from this sort of potential, this sort of, just logical possibility, and actually enter into being with a capital B, which is a kind of like presence, I think. And then in order to do that, it has to basically have this, he talks about like this necessary succession from kind of this constricting, negating potency, in order to have some kind of overcoming of a yes with this like spiritual aspect. And it needs to have this kind of progression in that form to do those things. So it basically, that's why there needs to be some kind of successive element to the actual revelation of these things. So that's kind of my initial answer. But I think if you go to the text, there's a whole bunch of just really intricate details that are probably worth going over. But yeah, that's my answer for now.
Hey, sorry. I didn't mean to, take your spot there. No. It just seemed like you were going to say something. But I think another part of the text that would be interesting to reference. I'm not as strong on this reading that we did this week as I have been on the previous. I think my camera's really zoomed in. I'm not as strong on this reading as I have been on certain other readings because not only I took a big nap before this seminar, so I didn't get my notes down all clean and proper, but also the last couple pages, similar to the last passage or the last reading, like last week's reading, but the last couple pages of this reading, I was expressing my frustrations in the margins. I was like, I have completely lost the plot. I have what's he saying here? Why does he assume that I know what this is? What is wrong with him? This is becoming almost schizoid. This is just absolutely deranged, and I have no sense of what's going on. But I wanted to go back to page 76 and 77 to reference, I think, a discussion of time that I think is potentially interesting or important here, because I just want to put forward my conception of what is happening and see if somebody says, yeah, that sounds good, or maybe no, that sounds blasphemous. So so on page 76 there starts this paragraph. I want to see, yes. So on page 76, the very bottom of page 76, there's a paragraph that says, such a decision was impossible in the earlier contradiction and was initially necessary in God. This is where I think his discussion becomes really interesting for me, because he's talking about what we were talking about, that infinite, tireless, circular fire of principles and potencies negating each other. Or I guess they were potencies at one point, and then they became principles. So he says, for then there was no essence that was free to be utterly one of the beings and not to be the other being. There was blind necessity, and all forces were already in effect. There it depended on bringing the forces. Which were reciprocally repressing and excluding each other in an incessant circulation from succession to simultaneity. So he's describing here like the move that I think God enacts on the very matter of God. This was only possible when they sank together to the expressible, to totality, with respect to something higher. In contrast, the talk is here of the highest self of the Godhead, which can never become being with respect to something else. This self can only have being and be active in each of its forms, if one is to permit this expression as the yes and as the no, and as the unity of both. Given the decisive contradiction between the yes and the no, this self is thinkable only because of the concept of different times. Hence, here it depends much more on the simultaneity among the different forms being sublimated and transformed into a succession. So basically, I think that what he's describing, I think that he's going on he's trying to, I think that he's built up to this point. This is the most direct explanation that he's given of what he, I think, is describing as the beginning, or like the birth of things. Where, and he talks about it later, where where he's talking about like the childhood question of what was God doing before he created all of the world? What was God so busy with? And his description or his answer is, well, you're asking about what was going on in the time before time, and that's no, that before time, the notion of all of the events, if we can call them events, which occurred before time or the start of creation, they and this is his words, and he talks about this on page 80. He describes them as vanishing into a single moment. And so what I'm back to page 77, I suppose. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. It seems like he's describing this moment where you had a single moment of potencies that were acting in succession. And they were brought by a higher order or a highest self, something else with respect to something higher. They were all lowered, right, sank into a state of simultaneity. And I think that this simultaneity, right, is then once again kind of superseded by a return to succession, but a different kind of succession altogether, I think, right? Because the vanishing moment, this vanishing moment before time that he's describing, which I get is a good way to describe this. It was in a state of succession in the sense that the principles that were present, the negation, the eternal yes, the eternal no, the unity of both, they completely, in their active sense, cancel out and negate one another and exist in complete contradiction and can make no progress. And then in the sense that they are made simultaneous, I think that it's God. If I could be reductionist and try and say this in as plain of English as possible, I think that it's God kind of taking this set of this succession of potencies and making them simultaneous in a very limited sense. I think it's God making them simultaneous in the sense that they are past, present, and future, but in the sense that, like ontology, like in the ontological notion of the word being, like if I die and I disappear and become ash, and 300 years later somebody talks about me, it talks about Hunter Griffith, I still have being in some sense. You know what I'm saying? I don't necessarily have being in actuality or in the present, but I still have some sort of being. And this is, and then to reference the future, Aristotle was one of the first to theorize the whole sea battle thing, his argument for determinism, which was, is there going to be a sea battle tomorrow? And if you answer yes, or if you answer no, one of those answers is technically correct. And so there is a way that, which, I don't think that it proves determinism as well as he does, but it's an interesting idea that there is a way that things are. There is a way that things are going to be, or at least going to be in actuality. And thus the future has some sort of being, but it's not a being that exists in actuality, similar to the past, which has vanished. So he makes everything simultaneous in the sense that it's got being in the past, being in the present, being in the future. You know what I'm saying? But then, and I think that this is almost just discursive. I think that this last move into succession again is almost discursive, or in reference to the soul of things. I think that he's moving the discussion from spirit to soul, in the sense that he says at the very last sentence of that paragraph, hence here it depends much more on the simultaneity among the different forms being sublimated and transformed into a succession. Right? I think that this succession is the temporal perspective on time, or like the positioning within time that contains a past and a present and a future. You know, for that position to be upheld at all, for that perspective to exist, there is some notion of succession. You know, succession in simultaneity with simultaneity. You know what I'm saying? There's a simultaneous succession and simultaneity going on simultaneously. And I'm like, I hate that I'm being made to speak this way, you know. But it's like, does that make sense? And I basically think that this discussion of I guess where I'm going with this, or where I think that he's going with this, or has been going with this, is to describe, and this is something that Travis got me thinking about a week or two ago. And I'd like to hear more on your thoughts, Eric and Nevin, on what's going on here, because I think you're both putting really actually good ideas in the chat that I'm only partially able to engage with because I'm kind of talking. And so I'd like to kind of shut up and be able to engage with it. But I think that just a lot of the principles that he's applying to this notion of God as the decision and as the cause and as this person, this thing with character in a sense. I think that they relate very heavily, if not, and he talks about it, there's this parallel or this direct sort of linkage between the experiences of the personhood of God, or of the character of God as a moral being, and the character of the individual, of man, and of our positing of an eternal past, and of our and this is kind of this is almost a conjecture, but I think that the way that he's talking about time here is very, the way that I'm able to make it make some sort of sense to me, even if it's like a faux sense, if it's like an illusory sort of sense. It's like, I think that human beings, or at least in Schelling's conception, and I happen to agree with this part of his idea. I very much agree with this. If this is something he's actually arguing for, I very much agree with it, that human beings and the experience of being human is one of temporality and of time, in the sense that temporality is the passage of time, but time, at least in Schelling's words, is a collection of eternities. And the way that I think that makes sense is when I have an eternal past and an eternal future, and I'm eternally embedded in the present. That's one thing, right? But also, let's say I get pissed off. Let's say I get really pissed off about something, and somebody says, "Why are you so pissed off? What's wrong? What's up?" And I say, "Oh, I've got this valid reason, and I've got this valid reason, and da 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 da." I'm mad about something. I am in a state of being. And I am not, and the funny thing about that state of being, the reason that I'm even able to hold on to it and to make it feel real or valid or believable, is because I could see myself being pissed until the end of time. In that state of being mad, I somehow am convinced that I could see myself, if things don't change, if the world doesn't start listening to what I have to say and changing its tune according to my demands, I could see myself being pissed off until heat death. I could reasonably, and that's why people say, "Oh yeah, well, what? Think about 5 minutes prior to me being mad. Would you, if I told you, oh, you're going to be mad in 5 minutes for this silly reason, I'd say, oh, no way. Or 5 minutes after I'm mad, I could. Oh, how unreasonable of me. Oh, I can't believe I did that. oh, I'm suddenly so aware of the finitude, the temporality, the limitation, the contingency of all of this. But as I am present and as I am existent and as I have some sort of participation or being in things, I am this creature that is dedicated or attached to the ideas of eternities in my feelings and in my reasoning and in my discoveries of things and of my meanings. You know, I think that there's some attachment to eternalizing of things that I think people do. And I think that that very much parallels this movement in God as he causes linear time to kind of arise out of, like what you said, Eric, this cyclical time of eternity in the vanishing moment, so to speak. So that's just what I'm thinking about, and that's kind of how I'm feeling. I don't know if that helped anything or what, but that's it.
Yeah, that helped. That was great. So yeah, I think one way to really see what he's trying to talk about is, well, a lot of what he's talking about is, there's this problem of, he's got all these different types of being. And then of course, Aristotelian logic, one thing can't be and then not be at the same time. And also, there's like you can't have two things that are opposites and then have them be at the same time. They have to be in different ways. And that's basically what he's talking about with these kind of like potencies as like successive moments of time. So that he's saying basically, okay, yeah, the past does not, it is not being or doesn't have being in the same way that the present has being. The future doesn't have being in the same way that the present has being. That's obvious. But that doesn't mean that they don't have some kind of being in some way. They're not utterly devoid of being in any way. And the way he does that is by saying basically the past is something like the ground of the present being that brought it to fruition. It's kind of like the movement that brought the present there, and then the future is kind of what's drawing it there as this potential that's implicit as this kind of quasi being in the present. So he's got this idea definitely of a kind of virtuality, where the virtual is, you can think of as this, it's simply potential that's real. And there's a difference between virtual as potential and then actuality, but that doesn't mean that the potential isn't something that isn't real in some way. Like for example, there's one example that people have given for like Deleuze and Bergson's idea of the virtual potential is basically there's a knife. Okay, the act of the knife cutting someone, stabbing someone, killing them, that is potential, that's virtual. That's this kind of thing that works with the actuality of the knife. It's there and has some kind of influence in some form without it actually having to stab someone in actuality at all times. And then there's something like that also with his notion about these different sorts of being, these different potencies basically. And I think that also has to do with this idea of kind of that there's this drawing effect or this like attractive effect too, that in a lot of ways they exist in like this relation with each other between these potencies, say between like, there's the negating force that is this kind of past, but then its being is something that is like inherently aiming at something else, something beyond it, which is that opposite state of, the expanding potencies and whatnot. And then, all these different levels of potencies and whatnot, they all kind of make each other up. Like there's this kind of like subterranean influence in all of them, where there's sort of being not only kind of like, I see it's kind of like pushed, from the previous one, but also kind of drawn from the future one as potential. Its potential is this kind of force of desire that's drawing it towards something. So that's all like horribly abstract, but I'm having trouble kind of putting it into concrete terms, in terms of like, events in history or something like that, because he is, in a way, he's talking about, I think, like, that historical kind of time thing, but he's also kind of like talking about this time outside of time, and this and the decision and all these things, they're happening basically in this like eternal moment that's deciding everything, but it has to play itself out in a kind of I don't know if linear time is the right way of putting it, but some kind of successive time. And I think that's why he says that the eternal is basically like coming into time, and not that there's like this complete separation between them, but I think it's more so the events in eternity, and in this decision, in this like willing act of creation of the Godhead to manifest itself, to like subjugate its like parts of itself into a certain successive mode of being. That all happened in eternity, but then it has to play out in all these different forms through this becoming and this successive act. And that's why there's this circular repetition of eternity, is because that eternal sort of choice or act or will or whatnot is repeated in each thing. And that's why there's this sort of reciprocal kind of interaction between eternity and time, because that's what's, in a way, it's kind of like the content of time is eternity, in the same way that for eternity the content of the eternal is about what will happen in time. So they kind of co-determine each other, in the same way that in the successive plane of time, you have also this kind of reciprocal relational thing going on between what actually has being, what is actual, and then what is potential. And also with this past is ground of the present that's not just simply a past present, but was truly something outside in a totally different register of time. So you can even like not even see it as past necessarily, because it's more just simply what had to be there in order for us to have what's going on now, essentially. So
Chase,
yeah, horribly abstract, but yeah, hopefully it
So-
helps.
Chase, you said so. You said something a minute ago that momentarily seemed to be helpful, and then I lost it. So it was, you said something about like in time, eternity is repeating itself, like within the moment or something, or would you go through that again?
Yeah, so the way that I see it is that, so the decision or the resolution, he also calls it, like the idea that the Godhead would decide to disclose something, and then that necessarily he decide or he figures out, I guess, there has to be this necessary successive way also of doing it. And all these things happen in this instant of, the decision for the Godhead to reveal itself. And basically what it's deciding on, though, in eternity is basically what is going to happen in time, or what essentially is happening in time. So that's what happens in eternity, but it's about time. So then you go down here to time, this kind of horizontal thing, and each thing that happens in time is something that was already kind of formally decided in some sense by what happened in eternity, by that decision, and by all those acts of will of the Godhead that were basically. So each time something occurs, that's this repetition of that decision in eternity. And then it keeps repeating, essentially, in the same way that, okay, so of course I couldn't help but see Deleuze in this, in the sense of, he says, repetition is a repetition of difference, of basically those same sort of ontological conditions that give things, that actually create things, that give something difference, something, this impetus of time to change. That's what's repeating, and that's what gives things like a sense of a moment, of an event that is separate from a different event, but yet not totally separate, because of course that wouldn't work. But then the sense that I think that's kind of what he's saying here, in the sense that, if you think of eternity, of what is the Godhead is basically like the creative principle. And what is repeating in each moment, what is a moment but some kind of like just new creation that's happening. And then another moment is just another way of those same conditions of creativity just coming back, repeating themselves. And that's what moments are. And I think that's kind of what he's saying, in the sense that eternity on some level is repeating itself in time. Yeah.
That's helpful. I'm sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Oh, no, yeah. I'm in large agreement with you, Chase. I noticed one word you used a few times, and I would alter it a bit, and that is the word determines. Because there were a few times I think you said something about this eternal, the eternal movement, the eternal cycle kind of determining what happens in a linear time. And I think it's more of a relationship of constraining or informing, but determining is the opposite of freedom. And I want to say, from what my reading and my understanding so far, what breaks this out, well, so just to backtrack, this eternal movement is a dynamic principle that exists before linear time or before history. I'm thinking of it in terms of it's like a repudiation of like Plato's static world of ideas. Schelling wants to put as the most fundamental level of being one that is dynamic, one that is not static. And so then we get this picture of the negating potency, the affirming potency, the union of these potencies, and then the dissolution of that union in a kind of movement. The negation, the affirmation, the union, then the breaking up of this union. And this to me is this is the dynamic eternal, which existed before the world was created. But the world is created in God deciding, and this is the important point where I was going to say, this is where I don't think determination is the idea. I think because freedom is important. God is free, and God of his free volition decides to posit himself outside of himself in order to know himself. And in doing so creates the world. And so it is a free act, and it's a radically contingent free act, because he could have done otherwise. But it's in this radically contingent free act to posit the world, or posit himself outside of himself to know himself, which is the creation of the world. Freedom comes into the picture. And so these eternal potencies, being of the nature of God, are going to manifest themselves in the world as it's created and in the history of the world, but also carry with them the same kind of freedom that God, in his free choice to create himself, also has made a world where freedom is part of that, especially it's part of that second potency. So freedom manifests in the second. I think he identifies it more with the second potency, right? So that's just me quibbling on that term, determines, because you said that the eternal time determines the historical or linear time. And I want to say that there's an element of freedom in the move from one to the other, but also in the development of the other, so that it's never fully determined. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let me specify exactly what I meant by that, because I think he does have a limited role for some kind of like determination, but you're definitely right that that act of the decision for the Godhead to manifest it, that is totally voluntary. And he makes that case multiple times in a very strong way, where he says, and a lot of what he's doing in this book, and especially the last one, is he wants to have all these things be to work with freedom, in the sense of that God is free and also that humans are free.
Right.
So the human part for this one, I think, is a little, first of all, he's not talking about it quite as much. He's not talking about humans in general as much. So it's a little hard to figure out, but I definitely agree that he's saying that the Godhead, when it makes this decision, it does it as something completely free. It does not have to manifest itself. It does not have to reveal itself. But then he does say that there's a determination that happens after that decision has been made, in terms of if it's going to reveal itself, it has to do it in a certain order for it to be possible, which is from the no to the yes. Because if it went from the yes to the no in this like degradation, it would just not reveal itself. It would just simply kind of die off, I guess, But and also he repeats something that he said in the freedom essay about humans, which was that so humans basically, they determine also in a kind of eternal state. I think maybe this is something having to do with the fact that maybe like our souls kind of share in the eternal spirit or something like that with God, in that kind of microcosm macrocosm thing. But he's basically saying that humans determine themselves in eternity in this free act that in time becomes determinate. And that's where he's going against this kind of reflective ego voluntarism kind of philosophy that would say, like Sartre would say basically that yeah, I make myself laugh. So consciousness, is freedom. He's saying no, that's not the case. Actually, it's pretty much an unconscious will that determines yourself in eternity. It has nothing to do with your conscious decision making here in the temporal empirical world. And so I think he's saying from that because he wants to basically do this thing that I think Hegel does the same thing, where he's kind of synthesizing, sorry to use that word, necessity and freedom, but he's putting freedom above necessity by saying that basically, yes, it's a free act, but that free act is what determines things that in that way. So I think as long as you understand that determination, I guess, is very qualified and limited, I think it still works. And I think he wants to point that out. Yeah. So I'm done.
I've been not trying real hard, but trying to some degree to frame his discussion here in this section with in the context of what he said at the very beginning of the book about A1, A2 and A3, and and the cracking open of the egg and all that kind of thing. And so my way of trying to integrate those, at least in this one place, is that initially you have that negation is prior, and I think it has to be because you have to have this egg. You've got to have a place to start. And if you started with the yes, then you would already have, I mean, the way I'm imagining it, is if you didn't have a Big Bang first, you would have started off with some universe somehow. And how did that happen? But you have to start off with something that then can be a beginning. And so you have this negation that encloses the affirmation and the unity. But then I recall him saying something like the negation freely, I've forgotten the way he puts it, but it sort of opens up a little bit and says, I mean, it sort of not negates itself, but it opens up its negation a little bit, it backs off. And then that's what allows the affirmation to emerge. And then that's the catalyst for this generation of this, this tripartite thing that Hunter drew a while back. So what I'm wondering, I don't need a definite answer to this, but what I'm kind of associating with in my mind is that initial freedom, having some, being associated with that initial opening of the negation and allowing this whole thing to crack open. And then at some point you get this succession of time after that. But anyway, I'm trying just to make those two kind of fit together.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate to the way I see it. And I think one way to also kind of think of this, so I think, the idea of the Big Bang, that gives a way to kind of at least put it in, it's not totally accurate to Schelling's system, but at least gives it some kind of like concrete or relatively more concrete referent. So I think what he'd want to say something about, this whole thing about time and all this stuff. Normally we'd think of the Big Bang as, or there was some kind of just nothingness, some kind of void, just was there, before the Big Bang. And then all of a sudden, there's an explosion of some kind or something. And then, you get this rapid inflation and expansion and all this stuff. And then eventually you get, conscious beings that are talking about it. And I think what Schelling would want to stress is that basically that same energy of movement that caused the Big Bang to go into effect, that's the same thing that's still occurring. So the Big Bang, it's not that exact in actuality, it's not the exact same. I guess in some ways it actually sort of is, like it's supposed to be the same energy. Anyways, that doesn't matter. So what he's saying is basically that, yeah, that same sort of movement of that decision that brought it into being is still ongoing. And that way you can also see that eternal past that was never present, that's what is before the Big Bang. We can't talk about it in terms of the present because it doesn't apply to it, because it was never present. It's the past of the past of the past, And so he's got this element, but that past had to be that way so that the Big Bang could explode into something. So you can see how they kind of reciprocate each other, how the past had to be the way it was not just for itself and its actuality, it's not just sitting there, you know, but because it already had some kind of potential in it to become, you know, the universe after the Big Bang, and then also in a future to become, you know, conscious beings talking about it. So that sounds pretty teleological, and I think he does want to have some kind of teleological element in this. Although he wants to kind of put those teleological elements in like to synthesize them with freedom. So whether he succeeds in that, I'm not totally sure, maybe, but that's at least one way to make it more concrete that helped with me. The other thing I want to, so Eric, you mentioned Plato and whatnot. One thing I think that I was upset that we didn't get to talk about this last time, because he gives up basically a theory of Plato's ideas that are, it's like a process Plato. It was really interesting the way he talks about, you know, the visions and the ideas as like glimpses of potential being that become being. So I thought that part was really interesting. You guys don't really need to comment on that necessarily, but I think it's very interesting that he's basically incorporating a kind of Platonism where it's like his version of the spirit world, you know, the A2, is pretty close to Plato's ideas of the forms, it seems like. What else was I going to say about? Oh yeah, also Plato's idea of time, at least in its like, you know, catchy one-liner. Time is, you know, the move. Wait, what is it? Time is the moving sphere of eternity. Yeah, that sounds kind of close to what Schelling is trying to talk about. So maybe there's quite the influence in there. What is that thing in my background? That is the baby from Eraserhead.
I changed my Facebook face recently to Eraserhead, but the
Oh,
adult
nice.
guy, and put my background to scene from Eraserhead. Most people have no idea. They're like, "What is this, COVID hair or what?" Like, it's Eraserhead.
I like that idea of COVID hair. That's good.
I was going to ask about you mentioned consciousness, and I think you're right. Because he specifically says at one point that this spirit of nature, I guess, that manifests is not a conscious spirit. It's like an intellectual instinct or something that emerges without initial consciousness. But then, he's also talking about the world soul last time, which confused me. So I'm wondering, and so when you were talking earlier about the past, the being of the past and the being of the future, like if I understood your illustration right, if you have a knife, it has this potential future as a weapon, but that, it seems to me, only has that potential for consciousness, because if there wasn't a consciousness aware of the knife, then there would be no awareness of its potential. And so I'm wondering about the role of consciousness in positing this sort of this past and this future. And again, I don't know how that fits, since he's explicitly said that the spirit of nature is not a consciousness, but maybe there's something about even this unconscious spirit that somehow has a similar kind of effect of positing a past and a future. But I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah. So the thing about consciousness and, like potentiality, that's a really interesting point, because, so I think you're right. I think, that idea of virtuality and whatnot, it's always going to be something that's relational, and that it's going to refer to basically, the whole network of everything. And that's why, yeah, that knife, it only has potential as a weapon, or I mean, it only is what it is because of that conscious intention, in a sense, to have, cutting devices and whatnot. But I think in terms of Schelling, because yeah, he talks about a lot of things. He's basically going against, that kind of the metaphysics of the subject of, especially reflective, like conceptual ideas and things like that. But and I agree with him to a large extent that I don't think that should be like the primary focus of philosophy and like the sole thing that everything is judged by. Although I wonder, so he's basically saying that, yeah, there's this moment, like that past that is this unconscious that has this, these sort of unconscious drives and affects and these motions, but there's no explicit consciousness, but it's also a kind of, yeah, what does he use? He says like intellectual drive, or I don't even, he has like some interesting phrases for it.
Instinct. I think he said intellectual instinct.
Instinct, yeah. So that's a really interesting notion. So I think what he's kind of trying to do there is say that's kind of the potential that can be expanded into something that will eventually be a kind of reflective consciousness. And that's the thing, this kind of like a sort of materialist account of consciousness, or a kind of emergentist or epiphenomenalist account of consciousness would say basically, it goes from absolute zero consciousness of any form, just absolute dead everything, and then all of a sudden, bam, just consciousness enters in. That account has never been very compelling to me. I think what makes sense with something like panpsychism or something like that, like maybe the way that Whitehead talks about it, would be more that what was there, in those intellectual instincts, that's the potentiality, or there in its actual, as something that is not necessarily what we would call conscious. It's not something that can also be sort of brought back to recollection in a present memory, but it is a kind of potential or virtual memory, I think, as Bergson would call it. And it's got, it is potential for that future of what will in actuality be a reflective consciousness, but it has to have something in it, not as, this explicit, that which has being, as being, capital B, but as potential being that's still real. It's still real, it's still virtual. And that's basically where consciousness has to be in relationship to that past of the unconscious, basically. Because otherwise, if you have that like a deep split between those two principles in this like absolute dualism, there's no way to go from one to the other. It seems like there has to be some kind of way of just kind of well, he talks about like this idea of like the implicate and the explicate, which I think he gets from Spinoza. And I think that's making more sense in this, that you have something that's actually kind of unitary as a process, as this generative moment in succession and simultaneity and all these things, but you have it's this one thing, but it has kind of a plurality of different motions, I guess, within it that act upon each other. I guess that's kind of beside the point, but I think that's a really good point about the consciousness and things like that, because I think he, does he really absolutely need some kind of consciousness, like even like a reflective, like straight up like representative consciousness. I think Schelling, he does, and I think he basically does say that essentially, that there's, isn't that what it do? Humans need to have like consciousness of God for these things to work, to really like reveal the Godhead to itself. Is that us as humans doing that in our consciousness? Because that would make sense with his ideas, I think, at least. So I think it's very important that he has consciousness as an element, but I think where he's going to kind of deviate from previous philosophies is that that's not his starting point, and it's not something that, he doesn't go from this like epistemological like cogito kind of thing and argue from just this self-presence of the ego to itself and all that stuff. But yeah, I'm done.
Oh God, I just forgot what I was gonna say. Oh, I remember. So when you're talking about the Platonic stuff, and I'm working from memory, I haven't gone back and read that passage, but it got the sense that, in that self-contained circular movement thing, whatever that is, the Godhead or whatever that is, that there are, it's like, I don't know if it's God or the Godhead, but is capable of, I don't know, seeing or grasping or understanding or something, these potential entities that could come about. And now again, putting that together with what he's saying in this section, maybe that's part of what happened. Maybe that's part of what that revelation entails, is the manifestation of these the manifestation of these Platonic ideas in the revelation of God. And so maybe there's a way in which somehow past and present as potentials are somehow also entailed in that potential revelations. You know what I'm saying? So you've got this thing kind of all wrapped in itself, but there's this potential revelation that is incorporated within it, and perhaps that potential revelation includes these forms and also possibly a potential past and future. And so maybe all of that kind of gets unwrapped and unrolled in the divine revelation, so that in some sense, maybe that's part of what it means to have the being of the past and the being of the present, that they're already in potential in that Godhead.
Yeah, I think one just important thought, or not, I don't know if it's important. What do I know? I'm upside down. There's one thing that I know that I thought of while you were speaking was, I think, and maybe this is just something that, because there's an old saying by Hegel, that we start from the fall. And that's, his argument, Hegel's argument using that phrase is on the idea of retroactive production of, yeah, that's true. He's dead. So it's to do with this Hegelian idea of absolute recoil, wherein the destruction or the loss of a dimension or an element of something retroactively produces the lost or destroyed element, which means like our fall from grace retroactively is what produces the idea of the existence of grace at all, in a sense, which we could talk about more, but the point is Schelling here. I think that Schelling is coming at this from a similar or close to that sort of perspective, where you were talking about these potencies that were kind of wrapped up together, that are unraveled or kind of explicated through the introduction of temporality, the cracking of the egg, and the yolk is kind of spilling out and becoming this. But I guess just something I'm thinking about. I don't really know what the implications of this are, but I feel like it's not just that the potencies, the principles, I guess, that we're dealing with, that we're talking about, that are existent in that cyclical eternal time, pre-time, vanishing moment thing. I don't think it's just that the lightning strikes and they begin sort of unraveling or making themselves present in actuality in entirety. Like they existed in this kind of functional grace, I guess. Like they existed in this form of grace, which then fell, or which was then fallen from, and then that was the creation of the material world or whatever. I think that in a certain sense, and I don't have any quotes from the text to justify this, I which I can find, but and maybe I think this is kind of related to his idea of like time as a succession of eternities, or maybe that's where I'm getting this kind of idea that the notion of these principles, or the existence or the presence or the being of these principles, is not merely like unraveled in a sense once the lightning strikes and once creation begins, but that I guess I'm stuck on this idea that Schelling puts forward on the eternally posited past, which means that the things which occurred in that vanishing moment before time, and that realm of cyclical eternity and potency, yes, that is prior, and it is in the past in some sense, but it's a posited past. You know what I mean? I think that that's important. I think that the fact that it's posited in this sense is important. I feel like God has existed for all of time and all of eternity, right? But I don't know if he existed before eternity, I guess, is kind of what I'm trying to say, which is kind of hard to understand, or for even me. Basically, what do you mean positive? When did I say positive? Wait, sorry.
You said the past has a positive existence?
No, sorry, a posited.
Oh, posited. Okay.
Yeah, because it's and that's what I'm saying. I think that, well, because the negation or the nature or the past of God is posited by God and is thus a real past, but is a positive past. And I think that I'm just stuck on this idea of the posited quality of the past, because it's giving me reason to believe, I guess, that the unraveling of those potencies that we talked about is not just an unraveling, but like a birthing at all, like a creation and an unraveling, a simultaneous, I guess, because for Hegel, I think that there would be like a primacy in the unraveling, in the creation. He would say that the unraveling is a creation, and this notion of them existing before and unraveling, that's kind of a phantasm. But I think that Schelling would say that it's both an unraveling and a creation simultaneously, I think, which is a part where they differ, but I don't know.
I wanna
Wait,
add to that.
what would Hegel?
So
Sorry, Eric, go ahead.
if we take the idea of the Big Bang as our analogy, right? So prior to any Big Bang, we have already pre-assumed like laws of physics, right? So in order to make sense of the Big Bang, we have to apply laws of physics and then start with an initial state and then extrapolate from that initial state. But we don't just start with an initial state. We also start with these laws of physics, right? So maybe these potencies can be analogous to the laws of physics, right? So there's, like, I don't, if that helps.
Yeah,
So
I see what you're saying.
So if you're going to say, well, what's prior to the Big Bang? Oh, that's a nonsensical question. There's no answer to that. Well, actually, you can say prior to the Big Bang, there's this, potency for dense matter to want to explode. You know what I mean? What before it actually explodes, there's a potency for it to explode, or there's a potency of of matter to collect into a singularity and then want to explode. You know what I mean? So we can meaningfully speak of something existing prior to the Big Bang, even if time itself begins with the Big Bang, if that makes sense. So I'm seeing these the eternal and the cyclical God. These are all aspects of God before he posits himself and creates the world. I'm seeing it analogous to these laws and these potencies. They're existing prior to the Big Bang, right? Which is the creation, as potencies.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder, so
With
So
creation
it'd be-
become principles, I think. But carry on.
yeah, so the principles I think are the ones that are like in successive time as actualities, I think. And then the potencies, sorry, those are the ones that are like successive in any moment of time, or I think, or maybe that's like I meant to reread that section before, but I did not. But yeah, I think that's helpful to see it in that sense, that the potency can be something like this element of, what are you guys saying? Our videos are telling as to our collective mental state. Oh, I see. Yeah. Yep, pretty much.
So
You know why I had this eraser head thing here is my friends they're this married couple and they're trying to conceive a child, but they're still like heavily drinking. So I was like, your kid's gonna look like the Eraserhead baby, and then I put that up there to remind them. So yeah, I'm probably gonna be the godfather if it happens. So I think Eraserhead 2 is gonna happen, and I'm probably gonna be taking care of that thing. Yeah.
Well, if it plays out in a way similar to that movie, I don't think you're going to be taking care of it for very long. You know.
Yeah.
Well, which is a relief in a way.
Yeah, is that thing, I mean, it was kind of cute at first, but then, after a while.
Then your wife leaves you, and your neighbor sees you as a weird baby in a suit, and then falls in love with a man covered in boils, and then you stab it to death with a fork. Anyway, so yeah, okay, Eric, I think you pointed to like a really like graspable, concrete sort of parallel to this prior to and created by at the same time. This simultaneous prior to and created by in the laws of physics for these potencies and the Big Bang. I really, really value that. And then it brings me to this. By the way, just to Chase, I remember you were kind of there. I heard murmuring of like a kind of like more investigation of the Hegelian position. Just before I move on, and I keep investigating this pre-time potencies being like the laws of physics, which I think is like, I really like that. At least it feels good. It makes me feel like I'm understanding something, which feels like yes, I'm smart finally. So I just think
you feel like you're understanding something, you're pretty much understanding it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I have an understanding. That's my qualifier as to how I can get away with saying pretty much whatever I want, whenever I want. It's my understanding. It's an understanding. I don't have the understanding. So, basically the only difference is that I guess I'm coming at this from a Hegelian perspective, or not a pseudo Hegelian, I guess, perspective, or with the background knowledge of Hegelian ideas, which is that we start from the fall, and the fall itself retroactively produces the grace, and the grace itself, or this idea of grace in itself, is kind of like a specter that haunts it haunts the system as it exists or as it plays itself out, um, but and this I could point to, and that's called absolute recoil. The idea is absolute recoil, and a good example of that is there's some old phrase, I forget who wrote it, but it was some biblical or Christian poetry that was saying that the only thing that could heal the wound is the spear which smote it, or whatever, or the stabbing into Christ with the spear and the wound is healed, or something. The idea is that the destruction, the removal of the thing produces the thing. That's as basic as I can put it, is that the destruction or the removal of the thing produces the thing destroyed or removed. And to go back to Schelling, unless we want to talk about that more, I think that I have a hard, because I'm coming at it kind of with that in mind, with that pre-existing idea in my consciousness, I'm having a hard time kind of really, like, whenever I try to approach ideas like these, I try to really think like, yes, like that's believable, like really put myself in a position where it's like, that is definitely agreeable. And I hadn't gotten there with this notion of the pre-time potencies and the unraveling of the potencies until you said, Eric, your comparison between them and the laws of physics. Because I totally buy that. I totally buy this idea of the laws of physics being present in reality and being, in a sense, prior to reality, so that the idea of the Big Bang makes sense at all. Because I think it's very parallel to Schelling taking a look kind of at what reality is and saying, okay, what has to have happened for this to be the way it is? What can I deductively kind of figure out as these necessary preconditions for things to have ended up where they are right now? But it brings us to this point where we have these potencies, or these tendencies, these principles, both being prior to and simultaneously created by the Big Bang, or I suppose not the Big Bang, that's the law of physics, created by and prior to, in a sense, the cracking of the egg. And I guess, yeah, and maybe this is, and like Nev, you're pointing to the kind of transcendental part. I'm not really, maybe it's just I think I'm weak. I have like a real like kind of conceptual weakness when it comes to like this area and like these sort of transcendental preconditions of thought and stuff. But like I'm having a hard time. I just feel like this prior to and created by thing it ends us in a contradiction, and the only way that I'm like figuring out the contradiction is that I don't know, God did it, and He's infinite and free, and so he can be contradictory if He wants, I suppose, because He's both the one and the other. But that's kind of where I'm, and maybe it's just because I've forgotten all the Schelling I've read up to this point, and so I look really stupid now. But I just, that's where I'm at. That's the roadblock I'm hitting now, is this contradiction between prior to and created by the Big Bang. I mean, aside from just that it is posited as such, it is posited as such. I can understand positing it as such and behaving as if, that sort of mentality. I get that. But for them to really have been there, I'm having a hard time. And I guess any thoughts about the transcendental conditions of this argument or whatever, just like, please, no, go ahead.
Yeah. So those are some really interesting questions. So I keep thinking, I think in general, when people mention, laws of the universe and stuff like that, I think of Whitehead's understanding of those things, which I think is really interesting. So basically what he's saying is that there's no kind of transcendental laws per se that are, just totally separate conditions from the, physical world or whatnot. Basically, the laws of physics are something that kind of co-arises with actual events of physics. So basically there's like electromagnetic events, and there's enough of them to basically create this kind of general global environment that leads towards just regular tendencies that are not absolute, but are just the prevailing tendency to act in a way that's like, it's like an electromagnetic universe because there's so many electromagnetic events going on. But there's not, those aren't necessarily one without the other. So I think in terms of Schelling, you could maybe understand it that, because I think he definitely wants to say that creation is this ongoing thing, and that there is also a kind of, so he seems to kind of have some like complications of this, but generally he wants to even have like this possibility that the potentials themselves seem to, that they can be independent and free in some sense. I mean, at least human beings can, definitely, for Schelling. But I think what he wants to do is he wants to say, you know, there is some kind of creation that's simultaneously, you know, going on with these things, or you could see them as maybe, you know, like transcendental conditions, potencies, laws of physics, things like that. So I think Schelling, okay, this is basically my like Whiteheadian version of Schelling, would basically be, okay, yeah, in that past before the Big Bang, that was still a being, but not a being in the sense of this like explicit actuality and time that we think of being now, because we're coming from the vantage point of time and whatnot. But there was still, it wasn't just nothing, you know, before the Big Bang, because otherwise there's no way to explain how it even happened. There had to be some kind of potential there in the Big Bang, a contraction, basically a densification of energy and matter, whatever, into something ready to explode. I know there wasn't actually really an explosion for the Big Bang, but anyways, never mind. So what he would say, I think, is that, okay, the laws of physics as they are now weren't being or existing in the same way before the Big Bang, but in the same way that there's like some kind of like condition, some form of being before the Big Bang. Also, there was some form of potency that is like the laws of physics, and those go together. Both, you know, you can see it as like this, like you know, like the infinite like density of matter and all this stuff, like contracting is simultaneous with some kind of like something we can understand as like the laws of physics, or like a global condition, in the same way that there's like event, but that's problematic because there's no time then anyways. Laws of physics and events are simultaneous, they create each other, and I think that would be true for before the Big Bang, but then there would be also a change in both conditions as the Big Bang occurred, so that the laws wouldn't be the self-same thing constantly, but yet they would also have a sense where they're kind of oscillating from like these potential forms of being into actuality and whatnot. All the same kind of dynamic thing is going on with the laws as are going on with, you know, being in its actuality. Does that make any sense? No, I guess not. Okay, I'll accept that.
Maybe I've got a simplified or simplistic sense, but in terms of trying to answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Sort of my conclusion from Schelling is that there has to be, I mean, it's not, I'm, to some degree repeating what Chase said, but there has to have been, I mean, it's hard to use to use temporal words again, but there had to be something. And I again, I get the sense that Schelling's trying to figure out what are the sort of like the necessary and sufficient conditions, or the minimal set of conditions for there to be anything. And it seems, you know, his answer to me seems to be there has to be this negating principle, this affirming principle, and then a principle of unity. And that is the baseline ontological, you know, necessity that this thing, and I don't again know what to use, you know, what word to use. Exists probably isn't right, is probably isn't right, but there's this, and that those are the fundamental potentials. And because of the very character of those potentials, because he uses this word character, you know, like as an analogy to human character, and that these potentials had a certain kind of character which resulted in this negation, negative principle releasing, and this whole thing unfolding. And as far as the positing, I mean, I don't know, I'm not sure what I'm resisting the interpretation that there's anything conscious going on here at this initial state, that it's almost, it's like these potential principles that maybe form the Godhead. And when they because of the character of these principles, when they crack open, you start getting these different entities and moments and so on, like nature and God. And then part of that process of when that thing cracks open is this positing of the eternal past. But I tend to want to resist saying it was some sort of conscious decision by a conscious entity that decided to posit an eternal past, but it's just, again, more a ramification of the character of this initial set of potencies. And when they opened up, there were just these things that happened, again, to use a wording correctly. And one of those is, if there is going to be some sort of temporal unfolding, there's got to be this, he keeps, you know, this business about the ground for this and the ground for that. There's got to be a ground for all this stuff. And so in order to get this temporal unfolding, you have to have this, you know, this eternal past. And so that's just part of what is posited in the process of that unfolding.
To that detail about it not being conscious, I'm reminded of the freedom essay where he talks about God yearning to give birth to himself from the dark ground. And there's nothing conscious, there's no consciousness implied in that yearning to be born or to give birth to oneself. And that is, if I remember correctly, in the freedom essay, he says that's a continual, ongoing, you know, ontological fact, or, you know, that's always operating in the background, I think.
Yeah, maybe you can even think of it as, you know, God still isn't conscious. Like, we're like these potential forms that are trying to, in a sense, like get towards God's consciousness of himself. But even that, we're just like these intimations, like almost like these imperfect, like stutterings of the enunciation of God's like future consciousness in a way. And yeah, that makes sense to me, that it's definitely not some kind of explicit like reflective consciousness. But then it, of course, the problem is basically, especially because we think of almost everything in terms of consciousness, or in these kind of like abstract, objectified ways of thinking that are actually dependent on consciousness, you know, materials don't recognize that. But anyways, I think something like a kind of desire, a will, like this sort of like affective, just like willing towards something, is something that could be not conscious in this sort of explicit reflective way, but is something that can still kind of bring something there, that can act as a decision, that can you know, act as an act, as something that, you know, snaps something. Yes, the Übermensch. I can't wait till we read Nietzsche. It's It's gonna be great. Yeah. So I
Yeah,
think
I
I
mean,
could keep going, but I think I'm done for now.
when you were talking about God not yet being conscious, there at the end, he was, talking about where God kind of splits. I don't know if that's the right way to think about it, but into this, well, the affirmation and the negation. And the negation is actually, I don't know if he says it has being or if it's big B being, but what's the actuality of God is this negative principle that sort of collapses into itself. And then that, I don't know, this is probably the wrong way to use this word too, but Hunter had that word about rebounding or whatever, that it's almost like this, the yes
Absolute
aspect,
recoil.
yeah. The yes aspect of God kind of recoils off that collapse of the negative, but it's a future. It's like, that's why, again, where I get that you were talking about that teleological sense. It sort of throws out this potential into the future toward which things are moving, but that affirmative aspect of God does not have the same kind of actuality as the negative principle.
Yeah. And I think, that's why it needs time to come to an understanding of those things, so that those things eventually can have some kind of big B being actuality through the succession of time. Just they can't have them all at the same time. So that's his big thing with, like, contradiction and whatnot, is that you can't have all these things that have being that are contradictory at the same time, but in a succession of times you can. And that was my understanding of basically what Hegel was basically saying when he says that. So I've seen some things like these, this guy who's like Jordan Peterson liked his book about postmodernism, which tells you about everything you know about this guy. But I can't remember his name, but like Hicks or something like that. So he said that he's a objectivist, like Ayn Rand, and yeah, exactly. Okay. But basically what he was saying was that everything after, like, Kant was an irrationalist, and basically everything after Kant and everything with, like, essentially, like, philosophy, especially continental philosophy. Yeah, it's like Rind, is that it? Rhine? Yeah, and Rhine, yeah. So basically Hegel was a complete irrationalist who rejected, like, the law of contradiction, and basically that's stupid, because what he was really saying was that, yes, something can be something else, but not simultaneously at different times. If you consider time as a factor, then the law of contradiction actually changes. It only applies to basically things at the same time. I mean, even like you can read like John Locke, and he even talks about that. But apparently this guy who really, I looked it up, and he really does have like a PhD, which is extraordinary to me. But yeah, that's what he said about Hegel. And he also, yeah, you should see, I watched this video about he has a book called Explaining Postmodernism that like sounds like hilarious. It's that's what he said about Hegel, was like he like violates like the most like sacred laws of reason. And yeah.
I mean, I will say, I mean, first off, I think that's like, yeah, I get it. I mean, he's conceiving of Hegel as like saying like, you know, you can have two things be. It's just such a, that's so, this thing is soft 1 minute, and then like this clay that I have is soft, and then I leave it out in the sun for a day, and then it gets hard and dry, and that's a contradiction in some sense. But I think Hegel
Yeah.
Hegel was trying to make his point clear when he was arguing for his thesis in college in 1806, and he had to debate his like the topics of his thesis in Latin. And one of the topics of his thesis was that contradiction is the realm of truth and non-contradiction is the realm of falsehood. And he was not saying like, things eventually will contradict each other or themselves, over time. But like I think that, and this is following with the readings of Miladin Doler, of what's her name, Zupančič, Elena Zupančič, and of Zizek, a number of people whose opinions I happen to respect. Who and this other one, Catherine Malabou, this like French woman. That Hegel, like a key concept in Hegelian thought is irony. It's not just the irony of a thought or of an idea or of a phrase. Oh well, Nevid, I haven't. I'm gonna have to look into that Kierkegaard argument where Kierkegaard says there are some contradictions that are not dialectical but are either or. Yeah, I'll have to take a look at that, and about whether or not either or contradictions are necessarily exclusive from being dialectically, or contained within a dialectical analysis or a dialectical movement. But just that Hegel's concept of contradiction is one of irony, wherein I say the phrase, it's raining out, and I say, wonderful weather we're having. And for that to be ironic, I need to say that and nothing else. If I go in line with this guy who said this book about explaining postmodernism, because postmodernism just don't make no sense, right? Well, let's get it in plain English. I think that this guy's sense of irony would be something like saying, "Oh, wonderful weather we're having. I'm being ironic, by the way." But Hegel would say, no, once you start doing that, once you say I'm being ironic, like you totally miss the point. It's no longer actually ironic. It's an illustration of irony. It's like a metaphor for irony, or an explanation of an example of what irony is like when used, rather than an actual application or use of irony. And in order for irony to be irony, for an ironic statement to be such, it has to be completely unaltered, and it has to be present as the exact same as what it would be without any sort of irony. I have to be able to have the exact same form as a non-ironic statement with the complete opposite content. And Hegel's basic argument is, at least in that debate of contradiction being the realm of truth, is that the world is ironic. It's not just us. We're not just these ironic, losers on this world of purity and goodness that we're always just shitting all over. It's that the world itself, as we approach it, is in a sense ironic, and there is a dimension of I would say coincidence of opposites within a single entity or notion or whatever, and to say that the coincidence of the opposites only occurs when the notion changes over time, I think that just completely misses the point. I think that's just changing the formula. I think that's just absurd to me in some sense, But then again, maybe this guy's got a PhD, and he probably would get very upset with me if I started talking to him this way. And I would probably say that his opinion in a slightly different way that would be slightly harder to respond to. And he would probably start raising his voice and overpower me. And people would start to believe him more than they believe me. And that's just the way that things go. That's my position.
No, this guy, just watch that video. He's like really his book is really bad, essentially. So he probably would raise his voice, because that'd probably be the only thing he'd probably be able to do. But I totally missed like the previous part of your conversation, so I just came in there at the very end, and figured I was competent enough to really respond to that. I guess that's pretty ignorant of me, but
I hope your pee was fun. I hope that your venture was fun.
it was okay. Yeah, I don't know. My prostate is kind of, I don't know. It could be stronger, I think. Yeah, it's kind of it's getting weak. I've noticed. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that Schelling has brought us.
Oh, we're
through
still
this moment
recording. Great. Yeah.
of vulnerability. Yes, I'm glad. All right.
Doctor told me that the best way to have a healthy prostate is vigorous and frequent sex.
Like,
Mm.
what about masturbation?
That
Same.
might-
Yeah.
Probably you should have said
Yeah.
frequent.
I mean, that makes sense. Yeah.
Vigorous. I need to make sure that it's nice and.
Yeah.
I need to get a
basically, if you
workout.
could, I think if you could like incorporate like thrusting into it, then masturbation would probably work.
Yeah,
think.
God, yeah, either that or just learn some new dance moves. The clap thrust, get a workout, do some Kegels. That's the message,
Kegels.
everybody.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
That's the lesson. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're a very
Yeah.
wise group of philosophical individuals. Yeah.
I mean, Schelling knew what was up, like the whole goal of his thing is, the female orgasm or whatever.
According to Sloterdijk, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. I still need to look that up and see like what his argument is, because it just intuitively seems like true to me. Yeah.
The pictures of him as a young man, he looked pretty handsome dude.
Yeah. Yeah. He knew what was up.
Yeah,
Yep.
but he aged like milk.
Yeah.
Yeah. He looked very, very
The
imposing.
vampire thing. Yeah.
Yeah, like a vampire. He looked very not welcoming, like as a person as he got older. It seemed
Probably made
likable.
a pact with the devil or something. They sucked the energy out of him.
Yeah, in order to write shit like this, he had to. it was like him learning to play the fiddle. It was like he's able to write theological theory like nobody else but himself soul.
But hold on. So he made a pact with the devil in order to write like theological philosophy really well. That's awesome.
I was going to say Schelling aged better than Nietzsche did, and Nietzsche aged better than Benjamin.
And but then that's kind of putting like aging at all is better than
Yeah,
that's
well,
it.
Benjamin didn't really age
No.
necessarily.
That's
That was
the
kind of
idea.
his thing.
Is that if you're able to age at all past a certain person, I'm aging better than them, because they were dead by now. So I feel like I'm doing a bit better.
Yeah.
I recommend not aging past 40. That's my recommendation. Shit just falls to pieces around 40. So
Dang. Oh.
don't do that. Just don't age past 40.
Apparently, speak back to prostates.
Yeah. Yeah.
40
Yeah.
is
The
age.
big problem. But if you can fix that problem, with the prostate, by the time you're 40, then you could kind of extend it a little longer, maybe.
Your youthful vigor.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Well,
Guess that's it. Yeah.
we're in, at least according to schedule, we're not meeting next week, I guess, because of the holiday. So our next meeting and last meeting will be 2 weeks from today. So
Wow.
yeah, that'll be
Where'd
it
all the time go?
although I guess the Kafka is going to keep going into December more.
Yeah, which by the way, we finished the castle. So the weak-willed should fear not and are welcome to rejoin the intrepid journey through
Yeah.
Kafka that we have been on. The castle's over. We're back to the short, easy shit stories. We welcome anyone and everyone.
I might try at some point. I finished grading one essay on Wednesday, and then Thursday I got another essay which I have not started yet. So we'll see if I can get a gap. I'll try to join some of those.
I think you'll want to give yourself a reading of something proper, like somewhere in the middle. You know what I mean? All this student writing, that. Just give me some Kafka for a few minutes.
Yeah, that would probably be helpful.
I mean, if anything, it's Metamorphosis. I'm guessing you've probably read that. So it's basically just talk about turning into a bug and modernity, maybe. I don't know. Capitalism, alienation,
How did I get?
or maybe well, Deleuze has some interesting takes on Metamorphosis, but yeah, we'll get to that when we actually talk about it.
One of the most interesting things about that story is it's like, you know, it's people are like, huh, you turned into a bug. That's, you know, they're not like, what? They're just like, oh, that's interesting. He's a bug now.
Yeah, I mean, what are you gonna do? Just like he's not a bug. He's not really a bug. What? No, he's a bug. Like everyone can see it. Like now, it's just like, what do you do now? He's a bug.
Feed him some milk.
Accept it.
You have to go with it. You can't sit around waiting for your real assistant to show up with your instruments. You just have to accept the assistance that the story gives you.
Yeah. Good castle reference. Yeah.
Okay, see ya.
Bye.
I'm terminating you.